Welcome to another episode of the Zealous Podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. This week, I get Tom Zheng to join me for some conversations. He is Director of Athlete Health and Performance and a former performance therapist for the San Francisco 49ers. He's down in Southern California doing his trade right now. But, normally when I get to talking with a guest, I hit the record button. And then after we're done with our session, I edit out the little small talk. But we just jumped right into conversation and it didn't stop. So you're going to find that a little bit here and there, I say, we're going to start recording this soon enough, but it's already underway. So maybe backyard production this week, but I think you're going to like it nonetheless. Be sure to subscribe and enjoy the show. Yeah, my memory sometimes it gets the better of me. So if I don't hit record now, sometimes I forget and we get into things. But I'm really curious about your background. I read the Sports Illustrated article on the Niners' secret weapon. That was really a nice compliment.
Very good compliment.
And I feel like we have been learning a lot of the same things, but probably from different channels. So I'm curious, where's your background? Where did you learn so much about biomechanics and closed chain biomechanics, especially?
So that's a very good question. I've got a pretty diverse background. So education-wise, my master's is in physiology, applied exercise science, and applied, why they said that, movement science. And my PhD is working on human health and performance. So I got a lot of what I've been applying as well as learning from that. I've also taken the NASM route, the National Academy of Sports Medicine, for the PES for training structure and corrective exercise.
How did you like that?
I thought it was very good. I thought it was a very good complement to the NSCA.
Okay, cool.
They have a slightly different training paradigm. They just add in basically a base layer of stability before you go into strength endurance. So I thought that was a very interesting and needed portion as well.
Yeah, I've done both those paths myself with NASM and SCA. So yeah,
Cool.
totally familiar, but it doesn't explain your deeper background. You're more, I won't say intuitive, but intuition is just basically the accumulation of knowledge in the unconscious that tries to get to the conscious, right? We think of
Yeah.
Malcolm Gladwell and Blink and all that, but I'm curious because it would behoove a lot of pro sports teams to have individuals that understand that previous injuries will set up compensatory patterns, and those patterns will eventually or could eventually cause wear and tear elsewhere. And it's not necessarily the site, the injury site or the symptomatic site is not necessarily the problem area. It could be the underlying cause of injuries gone by. So that's not taught in NASM, and I know I damn well know it's not in the NSCA because I'm one of the ones that's presenting to NSCA events and conferences and discussing this, and I'm getting, blank stares or jaws dropping and sometimes crickets. So what's up with that? Where'd you go? I'm really curious.
So I have to attribute that to a couple of sources. First of all, it's so I got a certification from the Egoscue Method, who specialize in postural restoration, similar to like a PRI.
I'm very familiar with Pete's work.
Oh, are you? Awesome.
Yeah. His one of his directors of the clinic he was probably the director back in the early 90s, became my first mentor in about 1995.
Nice.
And his name's Jeff Gluckman. And Jeff Brandt broke away from Pete and started to develop like more, I won't say personalized. He just had a little different take on things.
Right.
And he presented at a conference in the early 90s with the NSCA when it was in New Orleans. I think it was like 94. And then that later that year, I hired him to be my first mentor. So I've been doing posture realignment, re-education programs since that time.
Cool.
So that makes a little bit more sense. And what's the other avenue, the other element?
So that's kind of similar. That's kind of like what is a base layer as well as like a baseline of how my train of thought started. So
All right.
treat the body as a whole, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, and it sounds like we've got similar backgrounds in that regard. And the other aspect is I actually have to credit a lot of education, continued education at the Niners for. So our head of player performance, Ben Peterson, brought on one of his mentors, who's Bill Knowles, and his whole thing is he's like an ACL rehab specialist. I don't know if you heard him or not, but it's a lot of it is the baseline is arthrogenic inhibition as well as core body movement, which impacts like limbs. So that aligned very well with kind of the Egoscue philosophy as well. And
Nice.
then you kind of just kind of like you pick up the pieces and you build a toolbox and you figure out you have this centralized idea of body moves as a whole unit. Every joint is connected. Like you mentioned, biomechanics isn't a singular point movement. There's always a effect and a cause, right? So a knee pain might not be caused by the knee. It could be caused by improper loading, asymmetrical loading, all of that good stuff, right?
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly.
So
All right.
that's
Brilliant. Brilliant. Oh, I think we're going to have a really fun conversation. Just before we get underway, I'll give you a little background of what I've been doing. Of course, getting my eyes open in the early 90s when I was all into bodybuilding, powerlifting, isolating, the way that gyms and workouts typically were with breakdown sets and so on. And then to have my world rocked with the Egoscue and muscular balance and function development, realign the body. It just truly made me have to unlearn the things that I was taught to be the proper way of moving and exercising. And then that led me more and more down that kind of functional fitness path and got connected with Gary Gray and the Gray Institute. And
yep.
so studied with Gary and his colleagues for quite a while and got certified continuing education, chain reactions conferences or seminars. And then there are three-dimensional movement analysis performance systems, 3D maps. And then I got certified in applied functional science through the Gray Institute as well. And that just led me further down the rabbit hole. And I acquired my most recent mentor, I guess, for the last 8 years. His name is Gary Ward, and he's over in the UK. He wrote a book called What the Foot, kind of a tongue-in-cheek title, but it's essentially what he has done. What Gary Ward, not Gary Gray, but what Gary Ward has done is he has mapped out what every articulation does through three-dimensional space at every stage of the gait cycle. So breaking it down into 7 major phases, but he's mapped out 12, but there's like 5 primary phases in gait that will say where the articulation, the movements are quite different from one phase to the next. And in essence, if you think about bipedal ambulation, and the way in which we move is the most common means of locomotion. And every joint has certain the bones that connect to make the articulation have the joint surface itself has certain shapes, and therefore it kind of dictates movement. And so essentially what he's done is, again, he's mapped out through three-dimensional space what the entire gait cycle is. And once you start to get a better understanding of this, primarily closed chain biomechanics, then you get to look at the body with that as your map. So I will see the cuboid should be doing this, but it's actually doing this. When does it do that is actually at a different point in time. Can I get it to start to move in concert with the other tarsals and metatarsals? And then how does it feed up through the subtalar joint, up into the knee, to the hip, to the pelvis, all the way up to the head or out the wrists? And what we find is that there's these beautiful relationships, these joint coupling relationships that should occur at one specific moment in time every time somebody moves across the room. And so that's been a game changer for me. I mean, mapping out a person's resting posture using Egoscue or derivatives of, and then taking that resting posture and how does it behave when it has to move through space. And that's just, I love that stuff.
You know what? That speaks directly to me because a lot of the times that is my primary evaluation tool is a gait analysis. basically what you just mentioned, how the foot strikes the floor and the circumduction in the lower limb impacting the patella and the knee, which is going to go valgus or varus, and then impacting on how the hip flexes and extend. So who was that you mentioned again from the UK?
The name of his company is called Anatomy and Motion, or AIM, AIM, Anatomy and Motion, and his name is Gary Ward. He's just he's honestly, he's a savant when it comes to movement. When it comes to he taught me how to assess the foot in three planes of motion: rear foot, forefoot, and so I've been having my hands on literally thousands of feet now, and it's just so revealing every time you get someone's foot in your hands and in an open chain environment, and then you put it on the ground and watch how it behaves. And then when it's not kind of lining up the way you want, you can put it back in your hands and encourage this, or keep it on the ground. We use small little foam wedges to change the timing pattern, to encourage movement in one direction, or to slow it down, speeding up, slowing down, that type of thing. So
that is super cool, dude. That is very, very cool. Now,
no, it's cool.
So just out of curiosity, because we're talking about foot mechanics, what are your thoughts on insoles?
Well, you throw out the answer, it depends, ... right? So, so honestly, it really depends on the experience the foot needs to have. And in our culture, we have been kind of trying to stay away from pronation. When the foot has two roles in life. It is either going to land on the ground or it's going to push off the planet. And in order for it to land on the ground, it needs to drop and absorb in all three planes and all three arches. So we need it to pronate. The trouble is most people just stay in pronation and they don't properly supinate, and therefore they don't actually properly pronate because their trampoline springs are already worn out and they're just hitting the ground without any absorption. So if the insole is going to be such that it helps to encourage pronation and supination, then it could be really good. I don't think insoles that negate one or the other is the answer, because that would be like reading a book and only reading the even pages. And you're missing out on half the story. So I want to see that talus anteriorly tilt, internally rotate, and evert along with calcaneus when we go into pronation. But I certainly expect it to start to dorsiflex or posteriorly tilt and start to externally rotate and invert when we start to see supination. And what we'll find in the gait cycle is there's really only one moment in time out of all the gait phases when we're talking about closed chain. There's only one time to get pronation right. And we reach pronation, and then the rest of the journey is out of pronation into supination. So it's fascinating. It really is. I love it. I mean, it all depends. There will be people that you put an insole in and they become Olympians. And you take that same insole, you put it into somebody else's shoe, and you've crippled them for the day, and their back is killing them. So, it's okay. I like the thought that we're at least looking downward at the foot and its effect on the rest of the chain up above, and how the chain up above feeds down to the feet too. So it's this constant communication, oscillating back and forth, top to bottom, bottom to top. Yeah, I'm preaching to the choir. You know what I'm saying.
Dude, I love it. But you articulated it in a way that was very beneficial and very good to hear from me, right? Because I feel the same way. I feel the exact same way.
Well, that's what I got a sense of, and I think I'm just going to keep this podcast going. I think I'll figure out a way to get this thing started. Normally, I'd make introductions, but what the heck, Tom? I saw that article. I started reading, and normally, you read a paragraph or two and you get the gist of it. But the Sports Illustrated issue of you working with the Niners, it just got me really excited, because here is somebody that thinks along the same lines, who's at the professional sports level, working with a team that made it very, very far in the last season. It's just it's really just encouraging. So I guess I got to ask right now, I'll go into the podcast interview mode, right? How did you land a job with the Niners?
All right, so it's a very interesting and cool story. So I was actually brought on as I was working with the Egoscue Clinic down here in San Diego. The previous therapist that was working here got his position as the performance director or functional performance director with the Niners, and he actually asked if I would join them, and of course, you would take that opportunity in a heartbeat.
Heck
So
yeah.
that's exactly. And I'm originally from the Bay. I grew up in Oakland, so I was actually a Raiders fan. So it's a little,
I'm sorry to hear that. That's all right.
hey,
I'm a
it's okay.
Patriots fan, so whatever.
Oh, all right.
Come
Well, I
on.
mean, hey, Raiders are I think they're gonna do pretty well this year.
You were probably
Um,
like 5 years old when the tuck rule occurred. Didn't were you born yet?
I'm probably around there, sub 10 for sure, sub 10 for sure.
All right. So
Um,
you went over to the dark side and you joined the Niners.
Yep, absolutely. And it was an amazing experience. I wouldn't trade it for the world. The best parts were working with the players as well as being around a staff that was, I would consider, some of the brightest people in the world. And I got to learn a lot and grow my professional skill set. So it was a very cool experience, and I'm glad I was able to participate in it.
Right on. And so now you've moved on in some
Yep,
ways. You're back to SoCal,
yep.
and what are you doing down there?
So I currently work with the professional lacrosse team down here, the Seals, while they're in season, as well as I run my own performance training, therapy business on the side.
Oh, and when you say therapy, what type of therapy are we talking?
So I specialize in biomechanics, similar to what your background is. I figure out why a specific joint might not be loading properly and how that would elicit the symptom. I use a mixed tool bag of the Egoscue, the other certifications through NASM for training paradigms, background in exercise physiology to kind of build out programs for patients or clients so that they can kind of get back into an active, healthy lifestyle. On the flip side, if you're a professional athlete I work with, we work a lot on fixing some of the biomechanical compensatory patterns that you might have developed over years of specification or from a previous injury. And we just try to rewrite that a little bit so that you feel a little better, you move a little better, and hopefully you can play a little better as a result.
Sure. Okay. Anecdotally, can you share your average story of working with a client and what you found? They came in maybe with chronic or acute pain, and you were able to suss out the underlying causes. And because basically, what we are we're puzzle masters, aren't we? Isn't that what it is?
Yep, that's exactly what it is. It's
Yeah.
just the one big puzzle. So, um, great example. I had a patient earlier this week, I think. Oh no, that was this morning. It's funny how time flies. It's Monday. I was like, oh yeah, when did I see him? He was a former football player. He was a quarterback. I forget where he went, but he's in his early 40s now. He's a real estate agent and he owns his own real estate firm, but he's had a series of labral tears as well as I believe a meniscal surgery on his right leg. So his right foot actually pronates significantly more than his left. And he's been getting sacroiliac joint pain, but predominantly on the left side, so the opposite side, following the kinetic chain right there. So we basically did a lot of footwork, a lot of ankle and knee strength, and we didn't even touch his lower back. So we fixed the way he was able to walk, and in a period of basically maybe like 40-ish minutes, he felt immediate relief in that regard.
Don't you
So
love that?
I love that. It's phenomenal. You don't always do it, but it's always a good feeling to have when someone feels better and you can instantly see the change in their mood. They're happier, they're more energetic, and they're just ready for the day.
Yeah, they're ready to go use their body to do something, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, I had a fellow come in this morning also who could barely get out of his car, lower back all locked up. And he took a different car than he normally did, and it's a manual transmission. So as he was putting down the clutch, his back seized up on the way here. And so he walked in kind of like the Tin Man. And we just tried to see what he could do, and even equally so, what he could not do. And just from following the breadcrumbs from one thing to the other, his body told us essentially by interviewing it, asking him the body these questions. What is it that you really want? I mean,
Hmm.
I'm simplifying it completely, but that's kind of in my thought. Okay, what is the body looking to do? And then as soon as the body starts to experience that, then joints start to move in ways that they were haven't been moving. There's spacing that opens up or
Hmm.
closes depending upon the direction of the joint. That means that the tissue is going to have to either lengthen or shorten depending on which way the
Yep.
tissue is moving in regards to the skeleton. And then that fires up the nervous system. And then the next thing you know, we have a little re-education going on, and movement starts to be restored. And the next thing you know, he's walking around, and he left here going, I feel like I want to go hit a kickboxing bag. I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
now I'm not going to say go do that right now, but the fact that you want to go hit a kickboxing bag is great because you could barely walk in here right now. So you get that, I'm sure, all the time when you've whether it's NFL players that you're working with, where they just feel like, oh, I just want to go hit someone,
Hmm.
or average individuals, the general population, they feel like, oh, I think I can go swing my clubs now, or hit the tennis court, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail right on the head. Once you figure out what type of stimulus the body needs, usually it's either a bone adjustment or a change in length and tension between a muscle. The nervous system adapts to that so quickly that it just elicits a completely different reaction and different energy emanating from the person.
So help me out here with the Egoscue method. For those in the listening audience not familiar with Pete Egoscue, he's had a clinic in San Diego for 30 something 40 years. He started out, well, he didn't start out, but one of his main clients early on was Jack Nicklaus,
Hmm.
PGA master, and Jack had chronic low back pain, and he started working with Pete, and he was able to stay on the tour, and he, I think, wrote the foreword of a book that Pete wrote many years ago that was kind of monumental to me, and very kind of eye-opening. But one thing with the Egoscue approach is that most movements are isometric.
Hmm.
They're just simply held. Now, neurologically, I get it, because isometric, you're neurologically, it's dialing it down, low
Hmm.
volume. And the more movement, the more you have to ratchet that volume up to 11 in regards to Spinal Tap when we have full body action, right? But
Yeah.
but what about so when do you, as a practitioner, as a puzzle master, when do you start to take people from that single joint isometric, let's get this aligned here, and then let's get this, and connect them? But when do you start to throw in more dynamic, more complex movements?
That's a great question. So it's usually population dependent, right? So it depends on what the end goal for your patient or your client is. If it's a professional athlete, it's to feel as good as they can, feel less symptom, and be able to play and move well, right? But if you're working with somebody who is just kind of returning to fitness, so, and a possibly older type of population, then you would stick with that isometric phase a little bit longer, right? Because they don't have to have a rate of force production that's high. They're just looking to feel better, right? So it would drastically depend on the type of person you're working with, as well as what they're looking to do in the short term. So I love Egoscue as the principle, as well as how they approach the body in terms of muscular imbalance. But sometimes you also, like you mentioned, have to switch from the static to more of a dynamic to more of a strength base, right? Depending on the population you work with.
Yeah, and with that strength based, a lot of people are going to think, oh, okay, so you just grab the dumbbells or grab the barbell and you start at it. But honestly, what I have noticed over the course of my experience is that strength does not necessarily mean just instantly grabbing enormous amounts of external resistance. You just got the body to start
Yeah.
moving in a more efficient manner, in a more balanced way, and do not think that grabbing the 25 or 30-pound dumbbells and doing something with them is going to be the next step. Actually, for some really high level caliber athletes, I have them grab a 5-pound dumbbell,
Mhm.
and there's drool coming from their mouth. They're sweating profusely. They're shaking. They're going, "Are you kidding me?" I'm like, "Well, if we get the right just like cutting a diamond. It may be the hardest thing on earth, but at just the right angle, you can break that up. So with athletes, and I'm sure you found this, that if you give them just the right position, just the right movement, they are overwhelmingly impressed at how difficult that is.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think you hit the nail on the head. So strength isn't always about how much weight you can lift, right? A lot of it is what your body's able to do, what it's used to, and then doing something that's the complete opposite, that where they lack a lot of strength, where they're very weak. Well, I shouldn't say weak, just not adapted to the motion. So if you're able to put them in that position, it'll restore a little bit of the imbalance as well. It'll restore some of the function. It'll propagate better length tension dynamics between opposing muscles. And it'll give them the sense of the work that they're after without actually having them to go do like a 200-pound bench press, right?
Ah, great. Yeah. So my kind of in the back of my head, that's always there, that little voice and so on. If somebody comes in who's fairly sedentary and inactive, they are fairly static. Their bodies, therefore, are somewhat, we might say they live in isometric contractions because their bodies are fairly inactive. So I'm going to give them dynamic movements because, like you said, it's the opposite of what they're accustomed to. Whereas a dynamic individual who is the active athlete or whomever, somebody that's always on the go, I'm going to do just the opposite. I'm going to throw them into some static positions.
Yep.
And because it's the opposite of what they're accustomed to. So when it comes to like program design or thinking about restorative kind of strategies as well, I take that as one of those elements. And I'm sure you must do that too.
Yep, absolutely. You're 100% right. So for example, like we'll go with the track athlete, right?
Sure.
Their entire sport is forward movement, right? Go as fast as you can forward. So usually they're going to have a pretty decent disparity between the anterior and the posterior chain, right? Their posterior chain is going to be a little tighter. It's going to be a little shorter. So eccentrics in the posterior chain might have elicit a better response for that athlete as opposed to having them do something that's a concentric action on the anterior chain just because they're so used to it.
Yeah, I get it. Okay. So, total geek out time. Tom and Rock, here we go. So then if you've got a linear athlete who's so accustomed to going forward, then there's two of the planes of motion that can generate forward propulsion. Obviously sagittal plane, but also transverse. The third plane, however, has no involvement really with forward force production. So the frontal plane is like the bastard stepchild that's in the corner all tightened up. Wouldn't you say? Like when you get your linear athletes, I think from my own experience that the frontal plane is the plane with which they struggle the most.
You know, that's a very interesting point. I'm going to be completely honest with you on that one. I haven't thought that far in that aspect.
Okay, no
So
worries.
I love that you bring that up because I think you're right. I think they would struggle mightily with abduction and adduction on the frontal plane.
And then in my understanding, and because I was not formally trained by Pete Egoscue or anybody in the Egoscue clinics, but somebody who had left years ago, the way that I think of it and have been taught is that when you have a postural distortion in one of those planes, let's just take the shoulder as an example. When the shoulder is rounding forward, it's breaking away from the frontal plane. It's moving forward off the frontal plane. So frontal plane movements will help to restore the shoulder's positioning along be more congruent with the frontal plane. Therefore, abduction and adduction, even to some degree elevation, depression, any of those movements will help to elicit a corrective response and draw the body. Along the same lines, if I've got an elevated shoulder that's breaking through the transverse plane, and therefore I'll need to do some rotational motion that goes along the transverse plane to help bring that shoulder into the position it should be. And then of course the sagittal plane, well, with the shoulders it's kind of hard because I guess you would be kind of shifted more in the spine. So let's take the spine. If I've got some kind of shift laterally, whether it's a scoliotic shift or lateral flexion, that's a breakaway from the sagittal plane. So therefore doing some type of flexion extension along the sagittal plane will help restore it. Am I on the right line with that? Is that how you kind of think about it?
In a way, it is, but I completely get where you're coming from. It's similar to like, we'll go back to the shoulder example when you're going for like a external rotation of the shoulder for when somebody has an injured rotator cuff, right? Very commonly, a cue is to bring the shoulder down because everybody wants to
Yeah.
shrug up and guard that shoulder. So as you mentioned, when you're strengthening something in the transverse plane, it might have a direct effect on the frontal plane, right?
Right.
Are we kind of on
Yeah,
the
yeah,
same
yeah,
wavelength
yeah,
there?
yeah, right. I think we're on the same one.
Yeah. So the kinematics of the body is very, very similar in that way that I think every joint moves in relation to another, as well as every plane of motion, like you mentioned, has a direct or indirect effect on another plane of motion, right? You can be an extremely fast linear runner, but if you're going to be running curves or going sideways, you might be exceptionally slow. Similar to like how a muscle car can go really fast, but a sharp turn might throw it off course.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting you bring up the rotator cuff, and because I think you'll find also in your experience is that rarely is that ever where the problem is, even though they're complaining about rotator cuff. Same with knees, right? If somebody's got knee pain, rarely is it actually at the joint that the problem is. You've got a ball and socket below in the form of a foot and ankle complex, a ball and socket above in the form of a hip, and somewhere in the pages of an anatomy book, we have sectioned these off and named them what they are: a hip, a knee, and an ankle, when in truth, the foot and ankle is just the lower portion of the knee. Or maybe the knee is a higher portion of the foot and ankle, or maybe it's a lower portion of the hip. If we start to think in that way, it kind of just makes sense that, okay, well, maybe we should look elsewhere. Like if I am lacking some movement somewhere in the chain in the sagittal plane, maybe somewhere along that chain, I'll have excess motion. So where I
Mhm.
lose it in one place, I'm going to have to make up for it somewhere else. And maybe it doesn't stay in that plane. Maybe in lieu of getting movement through the sagittal plane, I've got to get more rotation. So where is it that I have more than I need, right?
Mhm.
Do you look at it in the same way? Do you look like where is there not enough and where is there too much? Kind of Goldilocks?
I do. I definitely do. And I definitely get where you're coming from. So to break it down, like let's just use a patella tendonitis as kind of like a example, right? Athletes develop a patella tendonitis because of the improper tracking of the patella as well as excessive forward load on the patella tendon. So that causes the shearing, that causes the inflammation. So let's just take that, we'll put it in the back of our heads, and then we'll go into, like, let's say if the athlete is a basketball player, right? A lot of up and down motion, a lot of impact, and a lot of loading in the lower extremity, right? So let's say the athlete lacks a lot of ankle range of motion, right? When you're coming up and down, now because the ankle can't bend, you're going to have a lot more excessive forward load and forward pressure on the knee, which over time can cause that tendon to be irritated. Same thing for the hip. A big loading joint is your hip, right? It's a ball and socket joint. It can move in more various planes of motion than the other ones. So if you don't have enough, let's say, external rotation, when you land, because your hip can't externally rotate, your knee's going to go valgus, and that's going to cause improper tracking of the patella. So a lot of the times, like these chronic nicky-nacky injuries are often developed, like you mentioned, from a lack of motion from one joint in the kinetic chain, causing a excessive motion in another joint, which latter causes the problem,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
But I think the actual joint itself, that's the problem area. The symptomatic joint also plays a large role in terms of kind of like a feedback loop. So let's say the athlete has developed that patellar tendonitis, you have to address the soft tissue aspect of it as well as the connective tissue aspect of it, because even if you mobilize the hip, you get the ankle to track like it should, the heel and the toe to strike and push off like it should, because of an existing pathology in the knee, you're still going to get that symptom, that improper tracking, which is going to skew your mechanics elsewhere.
I completely agree. It's really coming back to balance, isn't it? It's okay. The knee that's having the patella issue is seemingly overworked, but it could also come from not being worked enough, right? It's there
Correct.
needs to be a certain level of cooperation and teamwork through the whole chain. And so, it's very interesting that we conventionally just go to the symptomatic site, but in truth, what we need to do is kind of step back and look at the whole integrative unit. How does it move? What is missing? What's happening there? So I'm curious, when you brought your experience up to the Bay Area, you began working with the Niners, and you were there for last season, correct?
Yep, last three.
For the last 3 seasons. How I don't imagine you got much pushback because they're interested in you and coming up, but what was your initial experience getting into camp with the Niners, whether it was with the medical or training staff or the athletes? Like, how well were you received? Did you have any kind of like little tripping points?
There was definitely a little bit of a learning curve coming from a clinical setting to a professional team setting. It took, I would say, about maybe after the first 6 months or so for me personally to be comfortable enough to operate the way I want to operate. But I would say there wasn't a lot of pushback. I think everybody on the performance side is just looking after the player, hoping that they can help the player perform like they should, right? So this is just a different area of training that doesn't really infringe or impinge on anything. Like, for example, if you have a knee injury, you would always get your treatment first, and then you would get your alignment, and then you would get your strength and conditioning. So it's kind of like an easy workflow.
And you would be in the alignment portion.
I would be in the alignment portion, correct?
Okay, and were there other guys doing the same thing or other women doing the same thing with you?
Yeah, the person that brought me on, Elliot, he was the first one there doing that.
I see. All right.
Yep.
Okay, so you had somebody to kind of collaborate in the same realm.
Correct. So it was a pretty good environment. Like I mentioned, I learned a lot of different disciplines as well as a lot of different things during my time there. So I was very lucky to be a part of a multidisciplinary staff because it's always good. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. It's always good.
It's always good to have people of a different mindset because you can either take it constructively or you can take it not constructively, right? I'm a big fan of a critical as well as a constructive working environment just so you can grow your professional skill set so that because there's always things that you might not know that other people know better. Like a great example is nutrition and dietary habits. I know a little bit about it, not my area of expertise. So if I can refer you to somebody who's better than me at it, I can learn in that process as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, I agree. All right. So when it came to the whole team, did you see the whole team or were you only seeing the players that needed to be seen for some type? Well, everybody in the NFL plays injured, plays hurt, but did you see all the players or were they just
I would say
certain?
we saw a gross majority of players. It was, of course, it was voluntary basis, right? Like you didn't have to come see me if you didn't want to come see me, but generally you elicit a pretty good audience if you can help them feel a little better, right? You can mitigate the symptom, you educate them on, okay, well, your knee hurts because of your ankle, because of your hip, because of how your right shoulder rotates, right? It's definitely a cool process watching the player understand their own body and kind of get a feel for it because I think a lot of what separates them from a general population is how kinesthetically aware they are, since that is kind of their bread and butter is how their body moves and how it feels. So that's very cool to see someone's light bulb kind of go on like, you know what, I had that ankle injury a couple years ago. All right, that's when my knee started hurting. You follow what I'm saying?
I completely do. And so therein is instant buy-in. And they're just going to be knocking back on your door if they need to. They know that they can go there. Very, very cool with that. I'm just thinking with the players, and you mentioned, of course, history, whether it's history of trauma, different life experiences, shall we say, that cause the body to reorganize or renegotiate the way in which we move. These players are top level, like the Olympian level. They're professional NFL players. That means they are some of the best cheaters. when it comes to body movement. I'm not talking about in the field of play. I
Yeah.
don't mean it like that. So don't get me wrong. I mean, if I need to get from point A to point B, those guys are going to know how to get around their issues in the tissues, shall we say, and get there and faster than the next guy. So that takes the problem solving up another level,
Hmm.
right? So
Hmm.
it's like I wouldn't say you were speed dating from one player to the next, because you probably had a little bit. How much time would you spend with each player, by the way?
I would say on average probably like 15 minutes, but
Are you kidding me? That's it?
you're absolutely right. So that's kind of the coolest thing,
Oh,
is you really get to hone in on what you're good at and what you can do. But with that being said, the players, because you're right, they are the best cheaters in the world. Like they'll get to from point A to point B, they'll get it done however they have to, but that also means they have the quickest adaptation of anybody in the world. So
oh
if you
yeah.
provide them with a little bit of a leeway, a little bit of a thread, they're going to be able to, their bodies are going to be able to figure out themselves. So one of the biggest things that I've learned is you don't really want to mess too much with the Ferrari. If it's not running quite right, you just want to give it a little tweak, right?
All right. So what are your 15-minute tweaks? You got 15 minutes with somebody comes in, whether they're corners or running backs or receivers or whatever, or front linemen. What like first of all, did you notice a trend between the positions? Like
Oh
what
yeah,
you had to, yeah, what were your
yeah.
trends?
So I mean, obviously, with any different position group, they have different positional demands, and they have different specific muscle movement patterns that they have to adopt to. Like a O lineman is going to be substantially different than a D lineman, right? A D lineman is going to bull rush you. A O lineman is going to absorb and arch back. So they're going to have completely different types of compensatory patterns between the positions. Individually, they will, but it's less extravagant, if you will, right?
Are we talking mainly flexion extension between one
Uh,
and the
flex,
other?
Flexion extension, as well as a femoral disparity in terms of range of motion and strength. So, like, let's say you've played left guard for 15 years of your life. You're in a staggered stance. You're always pivoting back on one foot. So you're going to have overdevelopments in certain musculature on one leg that you wouldn't have in the other one, right?
Hmm.
So a lot of the times that's going to cause a pelvic disparity. That's going to cause a rotation as well as a lordosis in the lumbar, which is going to cause a little bit of hyperflexion in the thoracic. Now, different people also have different morphology. You have your classic stretchy guys, and you have your very short, tight, wound, fast guys. So that plays a factor into it. So the first thing you want to do is you want to evaluate, okay, what type of guy are you? What do you play? What are you going to be asked to do? Right? So based on that, that usually takes about 5 minutes. Then you just kind of see what you can do for them without impacting the movement pattern too much. Because
So
you,
the big buckets, what are you looking for? Are you looking at the position of the pelvis? Are you looking at the spine?
yep. So
What?
I'll look at I'll primarily look at the ankles first. I'll look at the foot and ankle complex, like which side is pronating when you go from a static position to a dynamic position. Like, does that asymmetry still exist? And if so, to what extent? How does that contour up to the knee in terms of, is it valgus? How does that contour up to your patella? Is your knee valgus? Is your patella pointing out at a 45-degree angle? Or is it internally rotated? So that'll tell you a lot about the quad deficiencies, right? It could be the VMO, it could be the VLO, things like that. So then you kind of just work your way through the body as quick as you can, and you figure out something that they can do that it'll make them feel a little better, but it also won't impact them if they had to run full speed. Because that's one of the big things, is if you have a 20 miles an hour guy, you don't really want to change his running mechanics too much, because that's going to change what part of his hamstring or what part of his calf gets integrated in the running motion, which can often lead to overuse or minor irritation.
See, it's a fine line that you're walking there. I mean, to try
Always.
and improve balance and efficiency without taking away from the mechanics. Uh, and but I will say this: in my understanding of neurology, is that the brain's primary purpose is survival. That's the priority, and therefore, in order for the brain to survive, it needs fuel and activation. And therefore, over the course of time, that brain has been hardwired to move it as efficiently as possible so that it can conserve energy for its own survival. Therefore, if you initiate or introduce a movement that is more efficient, that requires less energy for the same amount of force production or motion, then the brain's no dummy. It is going to start to latch on to that movement. And so I can't see how that would play into affecting linear speed.
So it's not really the speed, it's the use and activation of particular soft tissue, right?
Uh-huh.
So like a good example is lower limb rotation, tibial rotation impacts hamstring recruitment, right?
Okay.
So let's say you change somebody's foot and ankle placement. Let's say you adjust the calcaneus and you adjust the cuboid. Now they have more of a linear heel to toe strike. That might elicit a lot more work in the lateral hamstring or the medial hamstring, which if those fibers aren't used to working like that and you're having them go full speed and end range, that could result in a tear.
Sure.
So that's the component that you're really working a fine line with, is if the athlete isn't quite adapted to a different movement pattern, you haven't built a good base with them. Same thing with any training paradigm, right? You want to build a good base layer. You want to make sure they're going to be able to produce the power and have good form while they produce the power. And they're used to producing the power in that particular form. You can't just go, all right, you're going to go box jumps today right off the bat, right?
No, yeah, you're going to need some integration for adaptation, right? You're going to need to, as soon as they are done with, I'm gonna guess that you give no more than 3 things for them, but it could be more. I'll ask you that in a second. But you give them a little bit of a program for rebalancing, shall we say, bringing about better structural positioning. But then there should be something almost immediately following to integrate this back into their system for the brain to, whether that's walking, gentle jog, then I need you to get up to quarter speed, half speed. Now I want you to full sprint. I mean, do you do that?
Absolutely. So I always want to end with something that requires multiple joints in terms of movement, right? So you never want to just go like you never want to adjust a singular joint because, like you mentioned, you're going to have a ripple effect throughout the body, and the brain's going to latch onto it. And if it's right before a practice or right before a game, that's absolutely not preferable for the athlete. Not only are they physically moving different, but that might also elicit a mental response. They might not be used to sliding quite this way. They might not be used to turning quite this way. So that can impact player performance in that regard. So reintegrating something that requires the whole body to move, like you mentioned, a gentle jog, or even like a lunge or a crawl or something like that, helps innervate those new pathways as well as gets the body tuned up and warmed up, if you will.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. So how many exercises, shall we say? I hate using the word exercise. How many experiences, how many physical movements or static do you typically give them? How many elements do you say, okay, I need you to do this, this, and this?
It varies per player and it varies per person, right? It always
Yeah.
comes back down to how adapted are you and how close are we together in terms of how much we work together, right? If I've given you certain corrective exercises before that have elicited a response in your body and you know how that feels, all right, we can do a little bit more this time, right? But if it's like the first ever time we've worked together, I'll probably keep it within a good little framework, like you said, 2 to 3 exercises that don't cause a giant change, but enough to decrease the symptomology.
Gotcha. Do you have a plane of motion kind of hierarchy in which you go through? Do you follow through? Like, for instance, do you do sagittal, then frontal, then transverse, or do you go with the frontal plane actions, sagittal, then transverse? What do you
Depends
find?
where the deficiency is. So that's where the gait analysis comes in a big way, right? So a lot of people could be lacking extension, flexion. A lot of people could be counter rotated. So it just depends on where their body is the strongest and where they are the weakest, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. So what do you do for gait analysis? Because we hear that term all the time,
Yep.
and then but there's 1,001 approaches to gait analysis.
Well, that's why I was actually very curious about Gary Ward, because it seems like he's got a much more in-depth version of a gait analysis in particular to the foot and ankle than I use, but I use a little bit of a micro scale and a macro scale. So normally we're going to look at first from the bottom up how the foot contacts the floor, which part you push off of, how the knee reacts to it, and how your hip either flexes or extend. Then you look at the symmetry between the right and the left pelvis. Does one elevate more? Does it elevate less? Does that cause a counter rotation in the upper torso? Does it cause a head sway? So it's a very, very mixed bag of, you're looking at small joints that gradually expand to the entire body.
Gotcha. Yeah. How we do it is basically we can do it with video because there's too much information to try and watch in real time. You can see some of the gross imbalances if you know what you're looking for, but in terms of the underlying causes sometimes or what's missing, it helps to just videotape, and then what you do is compare the phases of gait. For instance, when the heel strikes the ground, there should be something occurring at the ankle, the knee, the hip, the pelvis, the spine, all the way through the chain. If you knew what should be occurring, then you can look at the moment when the left foot strikes the ground, comparing it to the right foot striking the ground. That pelvis should be doing one thing. Is it in three-dimensional space? You know, that type of thing. And
absolutely.
then when the toe comes down after striking, we call that suspension. Others will call it toe down, but there's closed chain biomechanics. It's the moment of the most pronation, the most absorption, the most deceleration. And there should be something that's going all the way up the chain there. Compare left and right in a video screen capture. And then from there, we begin to transition fully onto that single leg that had landed while the other one begins its swinging mechanics forward. So we've got transitional leg with a swing mechanics, and we compare those two. And so those three big things are what we're looking for. And we look at the other leg of what it's doing in relation, because it should more or less be doing the exact opposite of the foot that's on the ground. So that's kind of how we break apart gait analysis. But then, even then, I mean, half the time I don't even go into the video time. All I want to do is let's just get a sense of what the pelvis is doing. Where is it resting? And then, and in a dynamic way, standing there, how well do you tilt anteriorly and posteriorly? How well do you translate or sway left and right? How well do you laterally tilt left and right and rotate left and right? I mean, if I've got 15 minutes like you do and you're speed dating with NFL players, I'm going to say, hey, buddy, I'm going to watch your butt. That's all I'm going to do. Don't take me wrong, but it's sexy. Let's see what that thing does. All right. I haven't taken the workplace, the sexual harassment workplace in a while, so I don't know if I can do that anymore, but we'll see.
So what I'm getting is you're a butt guy and I'm a foot guy.
Woo, baby. All right. Fetishes galore. All right, Tom, I can't believe this has been an hour. We've been chatting away here. I would love to have another conversation with you somewhere down the road, because we're talking the same language, and we can totally delve deep into it. But I got to ask you one other question. On the wall behind you is the Yosemite Valley with El Cap in the foreground and Half Dome in the back. Have you climbed any of those?
I have. We actually got that because me and my wife and a couple of my friends climbed Half Dome a couple of years ago.
The backside, or you went up the face?
We went up the face.
Did you really?
Wait.
You bivouacked?
With the cables?
No, that's the back. No, okay. So you walked up with the cables. Still hairy as hell, but I thought you went up the face, like camping out on the cliff face.
Oh no.
Next year, right? Is that a paint by numbers, or did you do that yourself? What is that?
My wife did that actually. She's a
fantastic,
phenomenal artist. Phenomenal.
Wow, that's beautiful. All right, so if people want to find out more, obviously go into the Sports Illustrated article. I recommend people checking that out. Tom Zheng, just do a search for the SI article. It's pretty cool with the Niners. But people want to kind of check you out if they're in Southern California, or do you do virtual consultations online?
I do virtual. Okay. A lot of what I do is actually virtual. Yeah.
All right, then give us your contacts and how people can find out about you.
Sure. I don't currently have a website right now, but we're working on that. I primarily just work with people I've worked with in the past, but I can't accept new clients or new patients. I'll send you my email. You can post that in the
beautiful
caption. Yeah,
that's great. Well, I can't tell you what a fun time this has been chatting with you. I love the fact that there's individuals like yourself that have integrated into the world of professional sports, because it's definitely needed, and there's a place for you. So And in the private sector, I'm sure you're going to be equally, if not more successful. So thanks for coming on.
Well, I appreciate you having me, man. It was great talking to you. And yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for taking the time to interview me.
You got it.
And that's a wrap for the Zealous Podcast this week. I want to thank Tom Zheng for coming on, former secret weapon of the San Francisco 49ers. Next week, we've got the brand new head strength conditioning coordinator for the NBA champion Golden State Warriors. That's Mike Potenza. Join us next week as Mike and I chat about all things NBA. Until then, have a good week. Share and subscribe and all those fun things you should do with a podcast.